It was the 5th of January, 1988, in a church gymnasium in Pasadena, California, the First Church of the Nazarene. Nothing about it looked like a stage for tragedy. A handful of men, a bouncing ball, the squeak of sneakers on a hardwood floor. Just a friendly pickup game on an ordinary winter morning. And in the middle of it, a 40-year-old man, lean and quick, moving like the years hadn't touched him at all. Somebody asked him how he was feeling. He smiled and said 3 words, "I feel great." James Dobson, the evangelical broadcaster playing beside him, remembered those as Pete's final words. Less than a minute later, the man collapsed. He never got up. The man on that floor was Peter Press Maravich. To the basketball world, he was Pistol Pete, the greatest scorer college basketball had ever produced. 3,667 points in his college career, an average of 44.2 points a game. Numbers he put up before there was a three-point line, before there was a shot clock, in an era when freshmen weren't even allowed to play. Records that would stand for more than 50 years. The body that collapsed on that gym floor had carried a secret from birth. No doctor had discovered it, and Pete himself never knew it was there. The autopsy would reveal a heart, unlike almost any the specialists examining it had seen. His death supplies the mystery, but it is not the whole story. The deeper question is not whether Pistol Pete was a genius. Teammates, opponents, and the record book settled that argument long ago. The question is what that genius cost the boy taught to treat basketball not as something he played, but as the reason he existed. To understand why he was still on a basketball court at 40, years after his NBA career had ended, the story has to return to a steel town in Pennsylvania and the father who turned a 7-year-old boy into an experiment. He was born on the 22nd of June, 1947, in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, a hard steel town sitting along the river not far from Pittsburgh. It was a place built on furnaces and shift whistles, the kind of town where a man's worth was measured by what he could produce. And in the Maravich household, what a boy was supposed to produce was basketball. His father was Peter Maravich, but everybody called him Press. Press was the son of Serbian immigrants, a man who had been a professional player himself before turning to coaching. Basketball wasn't just his profession. It was his religion, his language, the only way he really knew how to say what was in his heart. And when he looked at his son, he didn't just see a boy. He saw possibility. He saw a project. Press started teaching Pete the fundamentals when the child was 7 years old. Not casually, not the way most fathers roll a ball out into the yard on a Saturday. This was instruction with intention behind it. Dribbling, passing, footwork, the mechanics of a shot, drilled over and over. For Press, love and basketball became almost the same thing. If he wanted to show his boy affection, he showed it through the game. Mark Kriegel's biography, Pistol, recounts the darker edge of that devotion. Press once threatened Pete with a .45 caliber pistol if the boy drank or got into trouble. More revealing than the weapon was the certainty behind it. Press was not wondering whether his son might become great. He had already selected the future, and childhood was being organized around protecting it. Press supplied the program, but Pete developed an appetite for repetition that could not simply be ordered into a child. A classmate once bet him $5 that he could not spin a basketball on his finger for an hour. Pete accepted. When the skin split and the finger began to bleed, he changed hands and continued until the hour ended. The $5 hardly mattered. The wager exposed the bargain Pete was already making with himself. Discomfort did not cancel an assignment, and basketball was always entitled to one more repetition. That mentality would produce the balance, touch, peripheral vision, and control that made his adult game appear spontaneous. The improvisation spectators saw was built from lonely, highly structured labor. It would also make stopping almost impossible once the work began damaging him instead of developing him. That was the pattern of his childhood, hours alone, by himself, drilling ball control tricks, passes, head fakes, long-range shots that seemed pointless to everyone but him. While other kids were out being kids, Pete was in a gym or a driveway, running his father's endless routines. When Pete was in junior high, Press took a job as head basketball coach at Clemson University. So the family's whole life revolved around the sport, top to bottom. Basketball wasn't a hobby in that house. It was the air they breathed. And somewhere in all that solitary practice, something started to bloom that no drill could teach. It happened in a junior-level game on a 3-on-1 fast break. Instead of the simple pass, Pete threw a behind-the-back bounce pass through a defender's legs right to a teammate for an easy layup. He never forgot that moment. Years later, he described it in his own words. "I think right then, Showtime was born in me." That flash of imagination would become his signature and his curse. The nickname that would follow him all the way to his grave, though, wasn't born on some grand stage. It started with a habit that made a skinny kid look like he was drawing a gun. The family eventually landed in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Pete enrolled at Needham B. Broughton High School. And it was there, in the ordinary hallways and gyms of a Carolina high school, that the legend got its name. It came from the way he shot. Pete had a habit of firing the ball from down at his side, almost from the hip, as if he were pulling a revolver out of a holster and squeezing off a round. Teammates and locals started calling him Pistol. Pistol Pete Maravich. It fit so perfectly that it stopped being a nickname and became who he was. By the time the world got to know him, hardly anybody thought of him as Peter anymore. Under the flash and growing fame, Kriegel describes a boy carrying depression, anxiety, and a spiritual emptiness that achievement did not relieve. His father's system helped create the player. It also made separating love, approval, and basketball almost impossible. That tension followed the rest of his life. Every trick that dazzled a crowd had been built during solitary hours. Every record strengthened the identity Press had designed while leaving Pete fewer ways to understand himself outside it. He was becoming a star and a stranger to himself at the same time. LSU turned the private father and son experiment into a public one. Press would control the program, Pete would control the ball, and a football school with almost no recent basketball success would become the stage on which both men were judged. Louisiana State University in the mid-60s was not a basketball school. It was a football school in a football region, and its basketball team had just limped through a season with a record of 3 wins and 20 losses. If you were a top recruit in America, LSU was not where you dreamed of going. But LSU had one thing no other program could offer Pete Maravich. It had his father. Press Maravich took the head coaching job with the Tigers, and the moment he did, everybody understood what was coming. The greatest young talent in the country was going to play for the one man who had built him from the age of 7. Coach and father in the same person on the biggest stage of Pete's life so far. There was a catch. The rules of that era did not allow freshmen to play on the varsity team, so Pete spent his first year playing freshman ball. And what he did in that freshman debut told the whole nation what was about to arrive. Against Southeastern Louisiana College, he put up 50 points, pulled down 14 rebounds, and handed out 11 assists. 50, 14, and 11. In his very first college game at a level that was supposed to keep him waiting his turn. Pete scored 741 points for the freshman team, and none entered his official varsity total. The rules treated those games as a separate apprenticeship. The most prolific Division I scoring career would therefore exclude an entire season in which he averaged more than 43 points. But there was something more complicated than statistics happening inside that program. On the varsity bench sat the man who was both his coach and his father, the architect of everything Pete could do. The line between mentorship and control, between raising a son and running a project, was now playing out in front of packed arenas and national cameras. Everything Press had poured into that boy for a decade was about to be tested in public. Once he became eligible for varsity competition, The separation between unofficial spectacle and official record disappeared. It required only 7 games for a mark belonging to future Hall of Famer Bob Pettit to fall. Pete scored 48 against Tampa in his varsity debut. In the 7th game, he produced 58 against Mississippi State and broke Pettit's Southeastern Conference scoring record. Before opponents had accumulated even a month of useful film on him, Maravich had already removed a legend from the conference book. It never slowed down. By his senior year, he was capable of things that sounded made up. In one game against Alabama, he scored 69 points in a wild 106-104 win. 69 points from one man. And when the dust finally settled on 3 varsity seasons, the totals looked less like statistics and more like a myth. 3,667 points, an average of 44.2 a game. The conditions make the total even more difficult to process. There was no three-point line, no shot clock, and none of his 741 freshman points counted. Defenses entered every game knowing who would shoot and still could not prevent him from averaging more than 43 points in any of his 3 varsity seasons. His Division I career total would remain unsurpassed for more than 50 years, until Caitlin Clark moved beyond it in 2024. Former LSU coach Dale Brown later charted Maravich's shots and estimated that a modern three-point line could have raised his average to roughly 57 points. That is a retrospective projection rather than an official statistic, but it illustrates where many of the attempts originated. Pete was taking shots the rules of his own era did not yet reward differently. The easy version says all those points produced nothing. The record is more complicated. LSU never reached the NCAA tournament during his career, but in his senior season, the Tigers finished 20-8 and advanced to the NIT Final Four, their first postseason appearance in 16 years. Maravich did not transform LSU into a national champion. He did transform a program that had gone 3-20 before his arrival into one capable of winning 20 games and playing deep into March. That distinction matters because the argument surrounding him was never simply talent versus failure. His teams improved, teammates benefited from his passing, and the crowds changed the status of LSU basketball. Yet the scale of his individual production created an expectation no ordinary improvement could satisfy. If 44 points did not end with an NCAA banner, critics could still ask what all the spectacle was for. That question followed him into the NBA, along with a contract that created resentment before he played his first professional minute. In 1970, the Atlanta Hawks made Pete Maravich the 3rd overall pick in the NBA draft. On paper, it was a dream landing spot, a young team getting the most famous college player in America. In reality, it was a collision waiting to happen. The trouble started with the money. Maravich signed a reported 5-year contract worth $1.9 million, an extraordinary commitment for that era. Veterans who had spent years establishing themselves were earning a fraction of what the rookie received before playing a professional minute. The contract made Pete the symbol of a changing salary structure and placed resentment inside the locker room before his first practice. Then there was the way he played. Pete arrived throwing behind-the-back passes, dribbling between his legs, and taking shots that seemed to begin before anybody else recognized the opening. The Hawks already belonged to veterans Lou Hudson and Walt Bellamy, stars with quieter rhythms and established places in the offense. Pete could make the crowd rise and leave a teammate wondering why the simple pass had not come. Every spectacular possession sold his talent while making the fit inside Atlanta's locker room harder to solve. The talent translated immediately. Pete averaged 23.2 points, made the all-rookie first team, and shared enough of the offense for Hudson to reach a career-high 26.8 per game. Atlanta still fell from 48 victories to 36. For people who already distrusted the rookie's style, the standings appeared to settle the argument. The roster told a fuller story. All-star wing Joe Caldwell had jumped to the rival ABA after averaging more than 21 points for Atlanta. The Hawks lost a proven scorer and defender, then inserted an expensive rookie into a hierarchy built around Hudson, Bellamy, and Bill Bridges. Pete added tension and occasionally forced the game toward his own imagination. He had also been asked to replace production that had already walked out the door. Atlanta reached the playoffs in each of his first 2 seasons, and Pete averaged 27.7 points in the 1972 postseason. The Hawks still never returned to their previous level. That left 2 truths visible at once. Maravich could perform against playoff defenses, and the team had not discovered how to turn its unusual collection of talent into lasting progress. His 3rd season made that contradiction even harder to ignore. By his 3rd season in Atlanta, Pete Maravich had figured out how to score in the NBA at will. He averaged 26.1 points a game and handed out nearly 7 assists a night, proving he could be a facilitator, not just a shooter. And that year, he and Lou Hudson, the very teammate whose steady style clashed with Pete's flash, did something remarkable together. Maravich piled up 2,063 points that season. Hudson added 2,029. That made them only the 2nd pair of teammates in the entire history of the NBA to each cross 2,000 points in a single season. 2 men who came from opposite basketball worlds, briefly united in the record books. On the stat sheet, it looked like a partnership finally clicking. The next season, Pete improved again as a scorer. In 1973 and 74, he averaged 27.7 points, 2nd in the league, and earned another All-Star selection. Atlanta finished 35 and 47 and missed the playoffs. The better he became, the harder it was to explain why the Hawks kept moving backward. The friction was also becoming public. His relationship with coach Cotton Fitzsimmons deteriorated until the team suspended Pete for 2 games. One of the league's highest-scoring guards was now fighting the system meant to organize his talent. Maravich understood basketball at remarkable speed, but he resisted being told that the opening he saw should be ignored. Losing made those disagreements louder and patience inside the team shorter. Years later, Hudson summarized the contradiction without pretending it had been simple. Raw talent-wise, he called Pete the greatest who ever played. Then he added a sentence that captured the human burden beneath the highlights. It never looked easy being Pete Maravich. Coming from the teammate whose role and salary had been disrupted by Pete's arrival, the recognition carried more weight than uncomplicated praise. Atlanta's answer was a trade. New Orleans' answer was to make one player the foundation of a franchise that had not yet played a game. The Jazz acquired Maravich before the organization had settled on a general manager, a coach, or even its permanent nickname. Basketball operations were still being assembled around a marketing decision already made. The price reflected that decision. New Orleans sent 2 players, 4 draft selections, and additional considerations to Atlanta. The expansion club needed more than 27 points a night. It needed a reason for Louisiana to care before the rest of the roster had names, and Pistol Pete already belonged to the state's memory. Fans had watched him turn LSU into an event and recognized the floppy socks before the Jazz even owned Uniform Ms. His return supplied the new team with a homecoming story, a ticket campaign, and a face. It also placed him on every poster. When an unfinished roster struggled, the player advertised as its reason for existing absorbed the disappointment. Expansion basketball was harsher than the homecoming campaign suggested. The first Jazz roster finished 23 and 59, the worst record in the league. Pete averaged 21.5 points, but shot 41.9%, his lowest figure to that point. The franchise had purchased an identity before it had assembled a functional team. The second season showed real progress. New Orleans rose to 38 victories, 15 more than the year before. Maravich averaged 25.9 points and made the All-NBA first team. The Jazz still missed the playoffs, but for one season, the growing win total began catching up with the attention Pete generated. The progress never became stability. During 5 seasons in New Orleans, the franchise changed coaches, team presidents, and roughly 30 players. The enormous trade package for Maravich had also reduced the resources available to build around him. Pete remained responsible for his shot selection, defense, and conflicts. Around him, almost every season introduced another lineup and another attempt to decide what the Jazz were supposed to be. The attempt to find him a backcourt partner produced one of the strangest chains in NBA history. Before the 1976 and 77 season, New Orleans signed veteran guard Gail Goodrich. The Jazz wanted a second scorer who could punish defenses for loading toward Pete. Under the free agency rules of the time, however, signing Goodrich required compensation to the Los Angeles Lakers, including a future first-round selection. New Orleans could not know exactly what that selection would become. By 1979, the Jazz owned the league's worst record, and the Lakers controlled their pick. Los Angeles won a coin flip for the first selection and used it on Irvin Magic Johnson. A transaction designed to give Pistol Pete help eventually delivered the central figure of Showtime to another franchise. The connection creates an almost impossible historical echo. The Jazz spent heavily to surround Maravich, the future cost helped build the Lakers, and in Pete's final season, Magic won a championship while Maravich joined rookie Larry Bird in Boston. The two players who would redefine the NBA's next decade entered the league as Pete was leaving it. One arrived through a pick connected to the failed construction around him. The other became his final famous teammate. The homecoming also coincided with the deepest loss of Pete's family life. His mother, Helen, died in 1974 after years of struggle inside the household. Kriegel's biography describes her death as suicide. Pete entered the expansion season grieving, while Louisiana promoted him as the smiling answer to a new franchise's problems. The public role demanded energy and wonder. At the moment, his private life offered neither. Press lost his wife, Pete lost his mother, and basketball remained the only language father and son had always shared. That made the game a refuge, but also preserved the pattern Pete could not escape. When life became unbearable, the response was still to work, perform, and produce another number. 2 seasons later, private grief and organizational turbulence had not reduced his offensive reach. Pete entered 1976 and 77 healthy enough to produce the finest scoring season of his professional career. He led the NBA at 31.1 points per game, the only scoring title of his career. The season represented the full professional expression of Press's drills and Pete's imagination. Deep shooting, sudden stops, improvised finishes, and passes that punished defenders for turning their heads toward the scorer. He scored at least 40 in 13 games and reached 54 times. On February 25, 1977, the New York Knicks brought Walt Frazier and one of the league's most respected defensive backcourts into the Superdome. Maravich produced the game that would define his NBA peak. Against the New York Knicks, Pete Maravich scored 68 points in a single game. 68. At the time, that was the most points ever scored by a guard in NBA history. Nobody who played his position had ever done it. And when you widened the lens to every position in the entire history of the league, only 2 men had ever scored more in a game than Pete did that night. Wilt Chamberlain and Elgin Baylor. That's the company he put himself in, a skinny kid from a steel town now standing beside giants of the sport. He needed only 43 minutes. Pete made 26 of 43 shots and 16 of 19 free throws while adding 6 rebounds and 6 assists. With 1 minute and 18 seconds still on the clock, he fouled out. The performance ended before the game did, leaving the Superdome to imagine how high the number might have climbed. New Orleans won 124-107, so the masterpiece could not be dismissed as scoring detached from the result. For one night, the individual show and the team outcome finally arrived together. Television preserved another side of the same skill. In the Red on Round Ball instructional segments, Celtics architect Red Auerbach placed Pete in front of a camera to demonstrate dribbling and passing. Maravich did not present the tricks as magic available only to him. He broke them into hand position, rhythm, and repetition, showing that the imagination audiences considered spontaneous rested on fundamentals practiced until they became invisible. The television version of Pete was calm and exact. He explained why a wrist pass arrived faster, how the fingertips changed direction, and how the eyes could move a defender before the ball moved. Viewers who knew only the highlights could see the construction underneath them. The flourishes came from fundamentals practiced so thoroughly that Pete could bend them without losing control. The Jazz still finished 35-47, the same record Atlanta had posted in Pete's final season there. He had reached the highest individual level of his NBA career and was again watching the playoffs from outside. A scoring title could fill the Superdome and confirm his place among the league's stars. It could not keep the same coach, president, or supporting cast in place long enough for the team to grow around it. Then the body that enabled the performance began removing it. The decline did not start as a gradual loss of speed. It arrived through one of the most recognizably Maravich decisions imaginable. During a game against Buffalo, Pete left the floor to throw a between-the-legs outlet pass nearly the length of the court. He landed awkwardly and damaged his knee. The pass embodied everything audiences loved, unnecessary to a traditionalist, completely logical to the imagination that saw it, and delivered at a physical price. Surgery on one knee, tendinitis in the other, and a bacterial infection combined to cost him 32 games in 1977 and 78. That season, CBS placed 32 NBA players into a televised HORSE tournament. The field included George Gervin, Bob McAdoo, Rick Barry, JoJo White, and Paul Westphal. Maravich advanced through the bracket to the final, a format perfectly suited to his range and invention. His injured knee prevented him from appearing, and Westphal received the title after a replacement exhibition. Pete had advanced through a competition built for imagination, only to watch the final without taking his shots. The tournament itself was a television novelty. The interruption was becoming familiar. His mind could still invent the finish, and his knee could remove him before it arrived. In the 50 games he managed to play, he still averaged 27 points and a Jazz best 6.7 assists. New Orleans finished 39-43, the closest the franchise came to a winning record during its Louisiana years, and missed the playoffs by 2 games. The season was not another example of numbers floating above total failure. It was the moment the team came closest, just as the body of its central player became unreliable. The next season, it got worse. In 1978 and 79, Pete managed to appear in only 49 games. He still averaged 22.6 points, and he earned his 5th All-Star selection, which would turn out to be his last. But anyone watching closely could see it. The quickness that had made him impossible to guard was fading. The explosion off the dribble, the sudden change of direction, the burst that left defenders grabbing at air. It was going, piece by piece. Maravich had always created through movement. He changed direction before a defender understood the setup, and delivered passes from angles that existed for only a second. The openings were still visible to him after the injuries. Reaching them was the problem. Every game forced his basketball mind to wait for knees that could no longer follow at the same speed. Then came another kind of upheaval, one he couldn't control at all. In 1979, team owner Sam Battistone decided to move the franchise clear across the country to Salt Lake City. The Jazz, a name born in New Orleans, a team built around a Louisiana hero, was being uprooted from the state that adored him. Pete moved with them. But he was leaving behind the region that had made him a god, heading somewhere he had no roots at all, on legs that could barely carry him. Utah also supplied a new coach, and a rule Pete's knees could not satisfy. The face of the franchise would spend 24 consecutive games outside the rotation. Salt Lake City was where it all came apart. Pete appeared in just 17 games early in that season, and the problem wasn't only the pain, it was what the pain prevented. His injuries kept him from practicing with the team. He simply couldn't get through the workouts that the rest of the roster went through. New coach Tom Nisalke applied a rule without regard for reputation. Players who did not practice would not play. Modern teams might describe the alternative as injury management. Utah treated participation in practice as the price of a place in the rotation, and Pete's knees could not pay it. The man who had been the entire show sat unused for 24 consecutive games. Fans in a new market had inherited his reputation without seeing the healthy player who created it. Maravich was trapped in a role he had never learned to inhabit: publicly present, professionally available, and functionally a spectator. On January 17, 1980, the Jazz waived him. The franchise that had surrendered 2 players, 4 draft selections, and additional draft considerations to acquire Pete no longer required another team to trade anything for him. The player once treated as the identity of an entire market was available for the cost of a contract and the risk attached to his knees. The identity crisis began before retirement. Basketball was already withdrawing the role Pete had been trained to occupy since he was 7. At 32, he remained Pistol Pete to the public, while the NBA was deciding it no longer needed the performance attached to the name. 5 days after Utah waived him, the league's best regular season team offered a final role. Boston did not need a franchise identity. It needed a damaged scorer to accept the smallest basketball assignment of his life. The call came from Boston. That same January of 1980, the Celtics, the top team in the entire NBA, signed Pete Maravich. This was a franchise on the rise, powered by a rookie named Larry Bird, who was in the middle of turning basketball on its head. The Celtics were rolling toward a 61-21 record, the best in the league. And into that winning machine walked Pistol Pete, near the end of the road. His role was completely new. Pete had spent most of his life as the first option and the reason an arena opened its doors. In Boston, he became a reserve asked to provide short bursts of offense around Bird, Dave Cowens, Cedric Maxwell, Tiny Archibald, and a team with its own hierarchy. Accepting that reduction could be read as surrender. Pete described it as access to something his career had denied him. "I wanted to be a winner," he said after joining the Celtics. He admitted that he had spent his career wondering how differently people might have judged him if he had entered the league with a winning organization. Boston could not rewrite Atlanta or New Orleans. It could give him one final chance to experience basketball without carrying the entire identity of the team. For the first time since his early Atlanta seasons, Maravich returned to the playoffs. He appeared in 9 postseason games as Boston reached the Eastern Conference Finals. Julius Erving and Philadelphia won the series 4-1, leaving Pete without the championship he had imagined. The ending was disappointing, but the 26 games in Boston were not empty. He had finally entered a winning structure without being asked to explain every result. His final season also introduced the three-point line, a rule almost perfectly suited to the shots Pete had spent years taking for only 2 points. Split between Utah and Boston, he attempted 15 threes and made 10. 15 attempts are far too few to establish a meaningful percentage, but the small sample carries an undeniable irony. The league finally rewarded the range he had developed, and his body allowed him only a brief experiment with it. 10 makes cannot prove what a younger Maravich would have become in a three-point offense. They explain why the question remains irresistible. At the end of that season, he walked away. He admitted, plainly, that his knees would never recover. But no one, not even Maravich himself, truly understood what happens to a man when the only thing he was ever built to be is suddenly, completely gone. He retired after 10 NBA seasons and 658 games, averaging 24.2 points and 5.4 assists. He made 5 All-Star teams and earned 4 All-NBA selections. At that moment, only Jerry West and Oscar Robertson had retired with higher scoring averages among NBA backcourt players. The career was substantial by any normal measure. Pete had never been taught to experience basketball as only a career. Pete was 32, an age when many stars begin adjusting their games for a final phase. His knees made the decision immediate. The crowds, schedule, and daily assignment that had organized his life since childhood disappeared together. Basketball had not merely employed him. It had supplied the answer whenever somebody asked who he was. For roughly 2 years, he withdrew from the public world. Pete later described himself as searching for life. He explored yoga, Hinduism, the writing of Thomas Merton, vegetarianism, macrobiotics, and even unidentified flying objects. The list can sound eccentric when separated from its purpose. He was testing possible identities with the same total concentration Press had once demanded from his jump shot. Kriegel's biography describes depression and a struggle with alcohol during those years. Retirement had removed the pressure Pete spent years resisting, but the freedom did not feel liberating. He had always answered uncertainty by returning to the gym. Now the gym itself belonged to the life he was trying to understand. Eventually, Pete embraced evangelical Christianity. The intensity remained, but its object changed. He began speaking publicly about faith, family, nutrition, and the distance between achievement and meaning. A few years before his death, he stated his preferred legacy directly. "I want to be remembered as a Christian, a person that serves Jesus to the utmost, not as a basketball player." The records still mattered to him, but they were no longer the first words in his definition of himself. Press had chosen basketball as the purpose of Pete's childhood. As an adult, Pete was finally making that choice for himself. The change also altered the final chapter between father and son. Press developed prostate cancer and spent years declining. Pete searched for treatments, traveled with him to Germany, fed him, changed his clothes, and bathed him when he could no longer care for himself. The father who had once controlled every repetition now depended on the son for the most basic acts of daily life. Press died on April 15, 1987. Pete had been selected for the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, but his father did not live to see the induction that May. Less than 9 months separated their deaths. Basketball had fused their identities, faith had given them another language, and illness reversed the roles before time ran out. On January 5, 1988, Pete traveled from Covington, Louisiana to Pasadena to record a segment for James Dobson's radio program. He intended to discuss the faith that had reorganized his life. After the recording, a group entered the church gym for a pickup game. Pete had not been playing regularly, but the movement returned easily enough to make the morning feel ordinary. A teammate asked how he felt. "I feel great," he answered. Less than a minute later, he collapsed. Attempts to revive him failed. He was 40 years old. The autopsy discovered that Pete had been born without a left coronary artery complex, one of the two systems normally supplying blood to the heart muscle. His right coronary artery had become grossly enlarged while compensating for the absent system. Examiners also found cardiomyopathy, an enlargement and weakening of the heart muscle. The condition was extraordinarily rare, and specialists did not claim perfect certainty about the final mechanism that caused his heart to stop. What they could establish was astonishing enough. Pete had completed thousands of practices, 83 varsity games averaging more than 44 points, and 10 NBA seasons, while one coronary system performed work normally divided between two. That fact does not mean he played with half a heart. His heart was complete, but its blood supply had developed through an abnormal route that escaped years of professional physical examinations. The same body celebrated for endurance and coordination had carried an invisible vulnerability from birth. His damaged knees ended the career everyone could see. The condition inside his chest ended the life nobody realized was at risk. Pete left his wife, Jackie, and 2 sons, 8-year-old Jason and 5-year-old Josh. Jackie shielded them from the media attention surrounding the death and did not take them to the funeral. The public wanted images of Pistol Pete's grieving family. She chose privacy for two boys still too young to understand why the world suddenly considered their father public property. Basketball nevertheless reached them. Jason later remembered Pete handing him a soft Nerf ball when he was a toddler. He missed, became angry, and continued shooting. His father recognized the reaction because he had responded the same way as a boy. Both sons eventually played college basketball, and Josh joined LSU as a reserve. Josh died in 2024 at 42, another early loss for a family already shaped by one. The clearest measure of Pete's basketball legacy came from people who had to imagine themselves inside his movements. Tiny Archibald, one of the greatest guards of the same era, later named Maravich and Isaiah Thomas as the two ball handlers he least wanted to face. Defenders could not determine where they were going, he explained, because the ball seemed attached to an imaginary string. When the NBA gathered its 50th anniversary team, Jason and Josh represented their father. Magic Johnson told them Pete was the original Showtime. Larry Bird compared his control of the ball to yo-yo tricks. Isaiah Thomas called him the greatest showman and most entertaining player he had ever watched. Those were not later writers projecting modern basketball onto old film. They were elite creators identifying a player whose possibilities had entered their own imaginations. Pete sometimes chose spectacle when a simpler play was available. The stars who followed him still understood what his experimentation had opened. Younger guards saw that a possession could contain a passing angle, hesitation, or shot their coaches had never diagrammed. Magic did not have to copy every Maravich movement. Pete had already given the next generation permission to search for another one. Institutions eventually caught up. Maravich entered the Hall of Fame in 1987. The Jazz and New Orleans Pelicans retired number 7, Atlanta retired number 44, and LSU retired number 23. He was named to both the NBA's 50th and 75th anniversary TMs. LSU's arena carried his name, and in 2022, a statue of him was unveiled outside it. His 3,667 college points remained the Division I career standard for more than half a century. Caitlin Clark passed the total in 2024, requiring 130 games to move beyond the number Pete reached in '83. His son Jason welcomed her achievement while viewing the records as products of different games. The old total finally changed. Its strangeness did not. By 1988, Pete had built a family, cared for his father, and found a faith he considered more important than fame. Basketball still lived in his hands and memory, but it no longer had to answer every question about who he was. That January morning carried none of the machinery that once surrounded Pistol Pete. There was no contract dispute, no coach to satisfy, no standings column, and no crowd waiting for a miracle. There was only a church gym, a few other players, and a game he could enter because he wanted to play it. When Pete said, "I feel great," nobody in the gym could know what was hidden inside his heart. His final years give the words another meaning. The game gave the world Pistol Pete. The harder achievement was Pete Maravich discovering that a person still existed underneath the name.